Hello, everyone. My name is Jack Bunce, and I'm your host here at the Decentralize Psychedelics podcast. Decentralize Psychedelics is an organization that explores practical use cases of decentralized cooperation for the field of psychedelic medicine. On this podcast, I and my guest break down and discuss practical use cases of tools, ideas, and frameworks for decentralized cooperation. This is our first episode, and my lucky guest today here is Chris Byrnes. Chris is an intellectual property and Web3 lawyer at Calyx Law, which is a cannabis and psychedelics boutique law firm. He's also part of the Counsel for the Protection of Sacred Plants at the Chacruna Institute and general counsel of Copyleft Cultivars, an organization working to protect plant genetics as a public good. Chris went to Georgetown Law, has a Masters of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School, and a Bachelors in Physics and Religion from Denison University. He is based in Madrid, where he is an adjunct professor of law and political economy at IE University. Chris, thank you so much for being our first guest here on the podcast. How are you doing today?
Hey, thanks so much, Jack, for the introduction, and really excited to be here, and more than happy to be the guinea pig, so to speak. I'm really excited by what Decentralized Psychedelics is doing, and happy to help start to bring people into its orbit.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, strengthening the orbit. Okay, so for the audience, I'm just going to break down exactly how we're intending to structure this. We do have a bunch of questions, and our goal here is to make this content feel relatively easy and accessible in terms of understanding the concepts that we're talking about and not going over anyone's heads. So as I said, we have a list of questions. I'm going to ask them to you, Chris, and basically we'll both aim to break down concepts to their most basic building blocks so that a wide audience can grasp what we're talking about.
Great. Yeah, I know that can be especially difficult when it's sort of navigating the intersection of things like intellectual property and Web3 and all of this. So I'm more than happy to sort of break things down and find it very useful and oftentimes a bit elusive for people to do so, but really glad that's our approach. Cool.
Okay. Glad to hear it. Okay, so I'm going to start with an easy one. How many NFTs do you own?
I probably only own maybe 4, none of which I paid for myself. So I just have a few that are like proof of attendance, and a few others that have been gifted to me for sort of pro bono legal work that I've done.
Cool. Okay. So not just images for show or for value, but proof, as you say, of things that you own or have attended, things like that.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. And so maybe just for the audience, as we're talking about this idea of an NFT being more than just a picture, would you mind explaining what a utility NFT is, what that means?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's helpful in the first instance to sort of think about broadly what these different types of tokens can do. We're familiar with tokens outside of the blockchain space as simple sort of coins or currencies that carry some value. Perhaps they're even like something as unique as a concert ticket or a festival ticket or something like that. In the blockchain space, all of those can be sort of reduced to this token. And amongst those tokens, there's tokens that represent value, things like ownership or some fractional ownership of some product or good. And then there's tokens that can be used like a utility token to give someone a governance right. This utility token might be used as more like a concert ticket or a festival ticket in terms of one needing to have a utility token in order to access a particular process or a particular room or a particular event, for instance. And then the utility token likewise can be representative of how much power one has inside of a process, like a governance process. The amount of utility tokens might count for the amount of votes or the voting power that one might have, for example.
Great. Yeah, thanks for laying that out. So, if I'm hearing right, it's kind of like it's a key, and each person has these keys that open different doors. And if you have lots of the same key, then maybe you can like open the door in a special way or faster or with certain permissions, like you can open the secret door or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Perhaps it's not even that dissimilar from certain psychedelic molecules or something, right? You get the right kind of utility token, you get the right psychedelic molecule, and you're going to be able to unlock certain doors and sort of access certain experiences that you otherwise might not have been able to.
Nice. Oh, what a lovely analogy. Cool. Okay, so how did you first get interested in tokens? And maybe this is a good opportunity if you want to share about your background and how you got into the Web3 and decentralization space as well.
Sure, yeah. So, I have somewhat of an unusual background for an intellectual property lawyer. Um, before law school, I did this master's in theological studies where I was working with different religious communities on sort of different types of liberation theologies, which are really sort of like beliefs in creating economic justice inside, sort of the world today, inside the modern economy. And for a lot of religious communities to sort of find a theological basis for creating some type of economic liberation, communities will often turn to their creation myths. So creation myths, for instance, in the Judeo-Christian, the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, are going to look, for instance, at Genesis. That would be a book of creation myth. Other traditions are going to look, to their own scriptures. I became really interested in intellectual property, actually, because I came to understand intellectual property as sort of the framework for how we deal with creation in the economy. And so I became interested in sort of the creation myth, so to speak, of intellectual property itself. And I sort of became fascinated in how one could use the intellectual property system to perhaps craft new sort of liberatory practice with intellectual property, trying to turn sometimes the intellectual property logic on its head. And we can talk more about why that may be necessary, but really to help people feel empowered with the intellectual property that they create. So that kind of belief brought me into my legal practice, where I'm a registered patent attorney. With my physics background, I am sort of authorized to write and prosecute patents at the patent office. I worked for a while doing patent litigation and doing patent risk management. I also have been active in the copyright space. I co-founded a nonprofit several years ago called Corporate Accountability Lab, where we began using international trade and intellectual property laws to try and create new legal mechanisms to hold corporations accountable for things like human rights abuses or environmental harm across supply chains. So all of that kind of interest and work led me into the sort of world of tokenomics and the Web3 world, because I've seen through sort of tokenomics the ability to kind of create a whole new real marketplace for intellectual property licensing. And I've been very eager to sort of use this marketplace to use the engineering of what are called intellectual property NFTs to create new things like intellectual property commons that can be used again to sort of advance a more kind of liberatory sort of economic project for intellectual property owners. So let me pause there because I know that already is probably so abstract, and I'm happy to dive more into any of those sort of nooks and crannies of what led me here. But it's just sort of been this fascinating pinnacle of a lot of different sort of thinking and work I've been doing before coming to Web3.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for walking through that. And it's interesting because it's sort of this like these different layers of creation, as you're talking about these creation myths, starting with religion and theology, and then realizing that that has a place in sort of the more economic world and in the business world, the legal world, and then basically adding this layer, this structural layer of how that's executed through cryptocurrency and well, more like blockchain, actually. Am I laying that out in a nice way?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, just to underscore the point around how close or how relevant it can be to look at the economy from a theological lens. There's a book by Harvey Cox, who is a former Harvard professor, who called "Market as God," the market as God, and he sort of walks through the study of how contemporary capitalism and even the way in which we organize cities has come to sort of place the economic market, the market, as sort of this godlike force inside the economy. And I think that lens is actually particularly helpful when it comes to intellectual property, because the way in which intellectual property is recognized and protected by the economy more generally is sort of full of assumptions that could probably be best characterized as sort of religious.
Wow, okay. Yeah, that's a helpful way to think about it. And it makes me think about Jamie Wheal in his book Recapture the Rapture. I don't know if you've read it or not, but he talks about sort of this evolution of belief systems that help us to frame our world. And he starts with religion, then moves into the modern, let's say, like economy. And now that sort of feels like it's actually failing a lot of people. It might be like a mix of government and economy for that second one, but the third is now like, how do we define a new paradigm where we are more like, what do we believe in when our institutions are failing us, when religion is, well, let's say in some ways failed us as this like only this path to freedom. And yeah, it's an interesting time to be so deeply embedded in this emerging space of Web3 where we kind of get to define what we believe in and then to encode it through blockchain, through code.
Yeah, and I think it's no accident that the psychedelics market, the sort of mainstreaming of the psychedelics market, is particularly attuned to the sort of religious, or at the very least spiritual, underpinnings of kind of the market itself. And there seems to be a deeper awareness or appreciation in the psychedelics market for how psychedelics themselves seem to transform our perspective on how to be in the world, and perhaps even how to sort of approach and design an economy for the psychedelics market that really serves the interests of its people and respects and recognizes the incredibly important role of historically marginalized communities, indigenous communities, communities of color who've long stewarded the kind of wisdom around psychedelics. And I think in that vein as well, the kind of intersection of new economics, Web3 economics, blockchain-based economics, and the mainstreaming of the psychedelic economy sort of lead us to a very special space for these types of experiments.
Yeah, well put. It's like all of these different paradigms, both new and old, that are like coalescing in this really lovely way to emerge. Well, yeah, I guess we'll see what emerges, but you're helping to shape what emerges in, I think, a pretty substantial way. Because when we look at projects in psychedelics and Web3 or decentralization, um, it feels like there is maybe a lot of talk and not necessarily a lot to show for it. And I think that's okay. I think that's just sort of where we're at in this space. It's quite early in terms of the psychedelic field really becoming mainstream, and probably a similar amount of a degree of earliness in terms of Web3 and decentralized cooperation. So I guess it might be a good segue to actually jump into what you have, well, one of the projects that you have been working on, which is like the specific use case of IP NFT legal engineering. So maybe if you just want to break that term down before we actually jump into its application.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So if you think kind of traditionally about what an intellectual property lawyer is, is likely to do, that if you had a problem arise and you wanted to approach an intellectual property lawyer, you're probably dealing with either the desire to, create some new IP and get it protected, or to license the IP. Um, Intellectual property licensing is really just about drafting contracts, between parties that outline the terms of sort of use and terms of agreement for different types of intellectual property. Those licenses are increasingly becoming networked themselves. And the reason being is that oftentimes when one enters into a license with respect to a single piece of IP, there's an interest to create cross licenses and to maybe create sub-license agreements that allow certain entities to pass licenses on and to sort of create a whole web, a whole ecosystem of entities who all want to commercialize the IP in some given way. The old economy, what we might call the Web 2 economy, or even the economy that's been around for hundreds of years of intellectual property licensing, hasn't really had a way to network and interconnect intellectual property licenses, these contracts themselves, with any new type of technology. So what Web3 and blockchain-based licensing and intellectual property NFTs sort of enable at a technological level is all of a sudden this sort of platform for us to begin to network and interconnect intellectual property licenses in new ways using smart contracts and sort of the distributed ledger that really is, the blockchain at some level. And what legal engineering is really all about is really just to give another word to the lawyering that we would expect IP lawyers to do in creating this network of IP contracts altogether, but to sort of underscore the different perspective that lawyers can bring to sort of designing these processes. Some of us, myself included, like to use the word like legal engineering, or to refer to what we're doing as legal design. And that's because in fact, it is much less about legal work or the need to be a lawyer in any way. And it is much more about kind of engineering economic structure, engineering the sort of networking of contracts that it sort of creates for an economy to sort of flow, the rules and conditions and all of these things. And so with IP NFT engineering, what we're really doing altogether is sort of doing almost like an architectural design for a network of intellectual property contracts and licenses. So I've been particularly busy thinking about how to design these in the Web3 world. This grows out of work I've been doing before I came to Web3 sort of experimenting with open source intellectual property licenses to begin to create a sort of different platform for networking, and being able to merge the sort of legal platforming with the technological platform now is really what enables us to do some particularly, I think, interesting things and innovative things with this IP NFT legal engineering.
Nice. Okay. So I want to break down an example, maybe a two-part example. And the first thing I'm thinking about is just sublicensing for people who aren't familiar. So let's say that I am an an artist, a designer, and I make a design and I license that design to you. When you sublicense it, what does that look like? Are you just like letting somebody else basically then use my design? Is there maybe rules around myself getting royalties or you getting royalties? What might an example of that look like?
Yeah, so I guess the first place to sort of begin in that type of a hypothetical is to know that the agreement between you, the intellectual property owner, and me, the licensee, the sort of initial licensee, that agreement is what is going to govern, is sort of the umbrella under which all if one is allowed to sublicense at all, the sublicense will have to operate within the sort of terms set forth in the agreement between the owner and the initial licensee. And so what we might see happen is you as an owner might grant a license perhaps to me. Let's say I am, for instance, in this example, a decentralized autonomous organization, right? So let's say I am a community in whatever sort of legal form we want to imagine these DAOs to be, these organizations to be. But what a licensor might do, an IP owner, is to say, here is a license to this whole DAO. The DAO is going to be empowered to sublicense now this IP subject to these terms. And now as an IP owner, I'm probably going to require that royalties from any sublicense agreement, some percentage will go back to me. I'm probably going to require that that the sublicensees maybe report on their sales in a way that I can have some transparency into. The whole purpose of me allowing the sublicense framework in the first place is to just try to kind of attract the economic expertise needed that an initial licensee might be able to provide, to then have the licensees network come in and help monetize or sort of commercialize the IP in a way that a sublicense would enable.
Okay, great. So that makes sense. And then when we're talking about the idea of networked IP, is that just basically having multiple nodes of people who are involved, like enabling people to be involved in larger numbers and perhaps in different types of relationship? So licensors or sub-licensors. Could you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah. So I think there's two ways that one can design a system for networked IP. The first would be, as you were mentioning, creating sort of nodes or points of intersection in the system that are organized around individuals or sort of IP owners or producers, and to make that organization really about the entities that sort of own the IP. Those entities may have their own business relationships between one another that will inform and impact the way in which that sort of networked IP is going to operate. The second way to design a networked IP system is to design it around the IP itself, such that a given piece of intellectual property or a given portfolio of intellectual property will constitute a node, and what we'll do is start to connect different IP portfolios together, so that someone who wants to utilize the networked IP can maybe pay for access to a certain portion of the network, maybe has to pay some utility to the network, some tax or something to the network more generally to access all of it. But both of those ways have different, both the organization around an entity or the organization around IP have different strengths and benefits. I'd say what we're seeing more often now is networked IP that's organized around the IP itself. But I think there's still going to be a lot more room for experimentation as things progress.
Nice. Okay. That makes sense. So let's say that we have in a general sense, we have our IP, we have our network of individuals or actors or parties, and then we have the rules that govern the relationships of how that IP is then used and how the benefits of sharing or licensing or whatever rules are shared among everyone. And these are sort of like the building blocks of this IP network or networked IP system. What is the advantage of putting that on the blockchain?
Yeah, so the sort of most fundamental advantage to using blockchain for as sort of for IP is almost surprisingly simple, and it's an advantage that comes simply from being able to track ownership of intellectual property and to be able to track who has actually taken a license, or at least the number of licenses and perhaps their cost. What this is really doing is treating the blockchain, which again I'll sort of zoom out to just refer to as a distributed ledger in this instance, because it's in thinking about a distributed ledger that can't be hacked as something that helps to make the IP use case more intuitive. And the reason why is that what we've seen in decentralized finance so far and in early efforts in decentralized science is to use a distributed ledger like a blockchain to share ownership. And we constantly are thinking about how the blockchain is going to track ownership. We can do that with IP as well, and that alone is useful. But what we've also been experimenting with is ways in which we use the distributed ledger merely to sort of track licensees of the IP. And so what we might do there on the blockchain is to take an IP NFT that represents ownership of the IP, and then we might fractionalize, which means we may sort of split that IP NFT up into a bunch of different shards or sort of little pieces. But rather than those little pieces actually constituting an ownership interest in the IP, it's just going to be a permission. It's just going to be a license that says, hey, the owner of this token is licensed to use this IP without ever claiming any ownership of it. This is unique in that it also has arguably an infinite supply. One can license out a piece of IP as many times as one wants, and it will never exhaust, because IP is just kind of this made up intangible thing anyways. And so by being able to track licensees on a ledger and even owners, we all of a sudden would gain visibility into the intellectual property licensing market that has just never existed in the history of the intellectual property economy. One of the most expensive things about dealing with intellectual property disputes and intellectual property licensing is actually figuring out how much other licensees have paid, who's already licensed, and in some instances, even just sort of tracking who owns the IP. One would be surprised, even with a patent, for instance, this really valuable economic tool. You would think a company shouldn't sort of lose track of who owns this. It happens far more frequently than one might expect. And what that does to sort of translate into dollars and cents is to cost entities who are doing large-scale intellectual property licensing, sometimes on the order of $40,000, $50,000 just in due diligence costs to sort of track IP ownership. So at its most basic level, using blockchain and distributed ledgers for intellectual property trading is itself somewhat revolutionary. There are additional kind of secondary benefits, which just kind of include an increased liquidity and an easier way in which one can actually begin to create systems for co-governing intellectual property portfolios for a community more broadly as well.
Amazing. So by making this public, this distributed ledger, we can just create a lot more transparency and visibility for everyone who's involved. And that has all of these sort of extra outcomes that it creates, like saving due diligence and just making things more fair for the entire market, not just the people involved in the IP network itself.
That's exactly right. Yeah, the biggest fear that most people have around intellectual property in the market is the creation of intellectual property trolls. We've heard of them, some as patent trolls, there's copyright trolls. What these entities do is acquire intellectual property, oftentimes through bankruptcy sales of another entity. They don't have any intention of actually commercializing or manufacturing themselves anything with the IP. Instead, their whole business model is simply to assert the intellectual property against others in the market and take these license fees. Now, the reason this business model is so disliked is because the business model itself is largely just preying upon the costs of engaging the legal system itself. And for another example here, let's say you have a patent lawsuit, you have a patent troll, you get sued by a patent troll on a patent that maybe should have never issued and that you don't infringe. And you think, okay, I just need to prove my case. Well, to simply prove your case that should be invalid and you don't infringe can cost, at a minimum, oftentimes $500,000 and easily go up into the millions. And the patent trolls know this. And so what they do is come and they offer you a settlement for less than the cost of litigation. So they may say, hey, look, it doesn't matter about the merits of this case. It's going to cost you so much to litigate anyways. Give me $80,000, for instance, right now. I'll give you a license and we'll just walk away and you'll save at least the 400. So while it seems so unfair for a lot of CFOs and shareholders, it's the most economically rational sort of decision to make. So what happens when we move to networked IP? One, we can eliminate the intellectual property troll market altogether by creating agreements between the contributors to the networked IP system that say, hey, we will never sell this IP or give it to an IP troll. And if an IP troll were to ever acquire it, then everyone gets a free license. We just sort of destroy the exclusivity around that IP, kind of sabotaging it in some way. We also can begin to kind of create community standards around how the IP should be kind of wielded more generally, who should own it, and at what costs licenses should be sort of afforded. And this also can really help undermine kind of the riskiest parts of the IP market. And this is all done more under the sort of nomenclature of what's called intellectual property commoning.
Okay, great. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty vicious thing of people to do, but it's a vicious world. So I'm glad to hear that this is a potential solution. And
Yeah.
I'm curious, what might this look like in the world of psychedelics? And if nothing exists yet that's a use case for this, what are some, what's one potential use case for this networked IP that is public and transparent?
Yeah. So an example that's been coming up that's been studied in the psychedelic space recently has been the patent that Compass Pathways had issued on a sort of crystalline form of psilocybin. The patent was then challenged by an entity called Freedom to Operate because it believed that the patent should have never issued. It's been difficult to kind of bring the invalidity challenge successfully through. And what this sort of has led to is speculation in the market that not that Compass Pathways itself is imminently going to sell any of its patents, including a patent like this, to a patent troll or anything like it, but there are investors involved in this sort of this end of the market. Christian Angermeyer has been on the record saying that he would use patents in order to exclude competition and try and create sort of exclusive market access. That all does a lot to the market to help enable entities like patent trolls. It also does a lot to the market to lead the market towards what we've seen dozens of times in the past in the intellectual property world, which is a kind of intellectual property war that chokes up all these resources for entities in the market and really just creates a standstill and sort of undermines research and development a lot. So what an IP commons in this space would do to kind of stop this would be to say, okay, hey, entities, let's maybe pool our IP. Let's cross-license each other, especially for research and development on all of this stuff. And let's say this is mostly smaller businesses, maybe public benefit corporations, maybe take MAPS. So many we can, Usona Institute, so many we can think of who are out there, Tactogen, doing a lot of good with public commitments to kind of handling their IP responsibly. Let's say these entities decided, hey, let's share, rather than let's just give all of our IP away. That's one option. Another could say, no, let's give our IP to each other, but let's not give it away to the entities, perhaps maybe not to Compass Pathways, who won't make these same commitments. And then what we do is if Compass or if these other entities want to assert their IP aggressively, we can have common defense agreements inside the commons that will say, hey, if you're attacked by one of these entities, you can maybe have access to this whole commons, this whole network of IP to assert back. It might not even be IP that you own in the first place, but it could be sort of leased out for defensive purposes. Things like that can sort of help allow in sort of a David and Goliath situation in the market. We can allow the kind of Davids to network together and to combine their strength into something that can maybe match a Goliath. And that's really what networked IP is really about from sort of a beneficial side.
Nice. It sounds pretty exciting. This idea of allowing smaller players to collaborate and to create this commons, this collective resource where they're able to just like draw on it, kind of like microfinance, to support one another and to build resilience. And that sort of is enabling, it sounds like, is enabling decentralization and less centralization among players in the market.
Exactly. We haven't yet successfully kind of rolled out an IP commons model. There's a lot that's under development to create a psychedelics commons or to, continue to develop the decentralized, I think, architecture that we need, like what we're doing with Decentralized Psychedelics and also with some other DAOs like PsyDAO and some of these others that may be launching soon. But it's the kind of innovations in licensing are so far along in development that I do feel optimistic we'll all get to kind of point to real life examples and experiments that are actually in force quite soon here.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm excited to see it. So, getting towards the end here, I think that we've laid quite a bit out in terms of building sequentially of like, what is this technology of networked IP? What is the legal engineering behind it? How does it apply to the psychedelic space? There's one thing that I'm still curious about, and that is for people who are listening, how can they learn more about what we're talking about, and how can they follow the work that you're doing and potentially contribute if they might feel inclined?
Yeah, thanks. You know, I'd say right now there isn't a centralized knowledge hub for really kind of tracking what's happening in the space of IP NFT legal engineering, for instance. That's something I've been thinking a lot about and thinking about how it would be useful to kind of provide a spot where everyone can get a clearer snapshot of what the vision for these projects are like. And I actually have been laying the groundwork for a website that I think will be up at reimagineip.space hopefully soon. I'll let you know when it publishes, but that's going to be a space where I pull together a few of these different projects and help to sort of outline a broader vision that kind of connects how these work. For now, if one wants to sort of learn as much as possible, most of this innovation that I'm working on is happening in an entity called VitaDAO, which is a DAO that's focused on longevity research. VitaDAO is part of this Molecule ecosystem. Molecule is essentially an IP NFT sort of marketplace and has been behind the development of a lot of this IP NFT architecture and engineering. Molecule is also about to launch PsyDAO, which will be function much like VitaDAO, but be a space for decentralized sort of crowdfunding and co-stewardship of IP portfolios that arise in the psychedelic space. Now, in VitaDAO, we are continuing to deploy some innovative licensing models that show how governance can work with IP NFTs through a program called FRIENDS, which stands for Fair, Reasonable, Ethical, and Non-Discriminatory Sublicensing. The acronym is a play both on, how people say friend or friends in the Web3 world. FRENS is sort of the meme, and a play on an IP licensing standard called FRAND, which is fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory licensing that's used in some instances. There's a Medium article on VitaDAO's Medium page that outlines the FRIENDS framework, and we're going to have some more collateral and sort of description of how FRIENDS works when we roll out the first actual fractionalized FRIENDS program in VitaDAO, which should be happening in the next month.
Great. Okay. Well, that sounds pretty exciting. And are people able to get involved with VitaDAO? Like, is that a public DAO?
It is, yeah. And I think at vitadao.com, one can go and kind of check out the website, click into the Discord server, which is where most of the kind of organizing is being done for the DAO. It's one of the most developed kind of open public DAOs that I've been a part of. It deployed over $2 million last year in research funding. It's minted 3 IP NFTs to date based off of research agreements that VitaDAO has made with different universities, University of Copenhagen. There's conversations in the works with a lot of top research universities, and yeah, anyone who wants to get involved can just pop into the Discord server, introduce themselves, and the VitaDAO core team is full time and will help kind of bring people into, help them find where they can contribute if they want to add value.
Awesome. Okay. Well, great. So there's some call to actions for anybody who's listening and feels called to support the work that you're doing, Chris, that VitaDAO's doing. Chris, this has been unreal. I'm so excited and grateful. Is there anything else that you want to share about or talk on before we wrap up?
No, the only other point, I guess, I know we talked about it a bit, but that I just love to kind of underscore is how important decentralization, especially of intellectual property, can be for sort of paying reparations and allowing for new means of reciprocity with indigenous communities and with historically marginalized communities in the space. We could talk, I think, forever about how to do that, and I'd be more than happy to. I'm writing a blog post that I'll publish through Chacruna probably in September that talks a lot about kind of the political economy of intellectual property and how it intersects with indigenous rights, and how it's been awfully exploitative historically. That will include some action items for how we can also all kind of occupy our own intellectual property in a way that maybe aligns with things we want to do, solidarity we want to show, and reciprocity we want to give. So just kind of want to underscore that as a space where if anyone is interested, either please reach out to me. You can find me on Twitter at ReimagineIP, or on Discord. Find me however you may like. I'm also on the Calyx Law website, and would be happy to talk further at any point about how to keep doing kind of the engineering around the ethics and culture in the psychedelic space and in decentralization more generally that help to ensure we're using the technologies and the tools for our broader purpose and not simply using them as new hacks to kind of do the same old thing.
Great. Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that. It sounds incredibly meaningful, the work you're talking about in terms of reciprocity. It's super, super important. So thank you. Chris,
Yeah.
It's been unreal. This is great. So just a note for everyone, I will include a whole bunch of links to everything that Chris is talking about in the show notes, so don't worry. And yeah, I think that's it. Anything you want to say before we end off, Chris?
No, just thank you so much for the time and opportunity, and really look forward to watching the podcast grow and continuing to stay involved with Decentralized Psychedelics. I think it's a really exciting initiative.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks. Take care, Jack.